Hi everyone, hope you're having a lovely Hanukkah. So this week I wanted to talk about a pet peeve of mine, which seems to have been coming up in conversation with various people a lot lately. So this is it. I was talking to a group of friends recently, and we were saying that all of our kids were in different years, and they'd all got to various bits of Chumash that they had mysteriously missed out when they got to it. And there seemed to be a pattern emerging of which bits of the Torah we're missing out. And someone called me last week who listened to my talk, and she noticed that I had missed out the story of Yehuda and Tamar. So I want to go on the record and say I didn't miss it out on purpose. I happened to miss it out because I got a bit carried away with Hanukkah. But I actually think that all these stories that we're missing out should really be spoken about a lot more. I've got this image in my head of Hashem dictating the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, who, as we all know, Moshe is a very frum guy. So I can imagine he's writing down, Bereshis bara Elokim, okay, very nice. And then we get to Noach. Noach was a tzaddik and his generation, also very nice. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the Yemahos. And then he gets to the story of Dinah and Shechem, and Hashem's dictating, and Moshe looks up at him and he's like, "Are you sure you want me to write this?" And he's like, yes, keep writing. And then they carry on writing and they get to the next part with Yehuda and Tamar. And then they get to the part with Yosef and Potiphar's wife. And at all these moments, Moshe pauses and he says to Hashem, we're writing this for a frum audience. Are you sure we should be including all this? Are you sure we shouldn't just be brushing it under the carpet and pretending it never happened? And Hashem says to him, no. Of course, Moshe didn't really say this. I'm sure him and Hashem were on the same side. But Hashem says, no, I want you to include all of these stories. These are very, very important stories to include, and we need to be talking about them. And we're not sweeping anything under the carpet because human relationships are very important, and we're writing a book for human beings who can learn. We're not writing a book about malachim, about angels. Human beings have human interactions, and things happen and mistakes happen, and it's okay to talk about it. And I kind of think to myself, who are we to be editing a book that was authored by Hashem? If Hashem felt it was okay to talk about these things, then we should be okay about talking about these things. So without further ado, let's talk about them. So going back to the Sedra last week, a couple of weeks ago, with Dinah and Shechem. At the time, I mentioned that actually there was one good end result of that relationship with Dinah and Shechem. And this crops up again in this week's Edra in Mikeitz. So Yosef has finally been brought out of jail, and Paro is very impressed with him. He's instated him as his second in command. He's now a very prominent person. And as such, Paro feels that he needs a wife, and he sorts him out with a gorgeous wife who was Osnas bas Potiphera. And all the Mefarshim jump in and say that this Osnas is actually not quite the daughter of Potiphar. She was brought up in Potiphar's house. If you recall, Potiphar was the master of the house that Yosef had been brought to in Mitzrayim. Potiphar had actually bought Yosef, and he was a slave in Potiphar's house. And this daughter, Osnas, was brought up as his own child. But actually, if you remember, we mentioned this a few weeks ago, she was the product of Dinah's relationship with Shechem. That one night stand resulted in a pregnancy, and Dinah gave birth to Osnas. And there's this incredible medrash which says that at the time, Dinah gave birth, and Yaakov gave this child away, and he left her under a thorn bush, and that's where her name comes from. The name of a thorn bush in Hebrew is sneh, and it's the same root as Osnas, so it's a little clue. And he left her with a charm necklace, and a malach found her and brought her and gave her to Potiphar's wife, who was unable to have children, and she brought her up as her own child. And now when Yosef comes to power, and he's very good looking, and all these women are throwing themselves at him, all these women are throwing flowers at him, and there's this one woman who throws her charm necklace at him. And of course, it's Osnas, and he sees this charm necklace and recognizes it, and he realizes this is his long lost niece. What are the chances that he's going to run across her in Mitzrayim? He's been sold there by all his horrible brothers, and she's been sent there as a baby. She maybe doesn't even remember where she comes from. And lo and behold, he's found her, and they get married. And she is actually the first mother to bring up children in Golis, and she shows us how it's done. And they produce these amazing children, Menashe and Ephraim, who grow up to be two of the Shvatim. Now, if you were to ask Yosef or Osnas at that point in their lives, how are you feeling? How's life going? I think they would probably say, you know what, I've actually had a really hard time. You know, it's not fun growing up with none of your siblings liking you. It's not nice being given away at birth. And actually, this is all pretty hard. And I think if at that point you're told them, you know what, you're actually part of a much bigger plan, hang in there and see how this pans out, they might be more okay with the hard things that they're going through. So let's hold on to that thought for a moment. And we're going to move on to last week's story with Yehuda and Tamar. So Yehuda, one of the Shvatim, he had 3 sons, and he married off the oldest one to this lady called Tamar, who, as it happens, I didn't know this, but as it happens, she was actually the daughter of Shem, which makes her 11 generations older than Yehuda, which is a bit mind-blowing. Doesn't necessarily mean she was an extremely old lady, because ages worked in a funny way then, but she was definitely significantly older than him. Anyway, puts the story in a slightly different light, possibly. But Yehuda married off his older son to Tamar, and his older son committed some sin, and Hashem kills him off, and she moves on to the next son, and Yehuda gives his next son, his middle son, to Tamar, and then he also dies. And at this point, Yehuda's thinking, oh, I don't think I want to marry off my younger son to him, and he kind of fobs her off and says, you know what, I'm going to wait till he grows up a bit, and then you can marry him. But she realizes eventually he's grown up, and she's still not managed to marry him. And so she comes up with this cunning plan. She dresses herself up as a prostitute, and she seduces Yehuda, and he sleeps with her unwittingly, unknowing who she was. He has recently lost his wife, and so, well, to give him the benefit of the doubt, he was actually a single man, and he found a single lady. And so possibly, according to strict halacha, he didn't do anything wrong, but I think, it was a little frowned upon. And it happens that a little while later, Tamar turns up pregnant, and all the townspeople are in uproar, and they're like, they say to Yehuda, who was quite a prominent member, have you seen your daughter-in-law Tamar? She's pregnant. And everyone's like, oh, but she's not married. How did this happen? And they decide it's only fair to burn her, because that's what they did then. And just as they're about to burn her, she casually says to Yehuda, the man who fathered my child has left me with these belongings. And she holds up these items that actually belong to Yehuda. And he's like, oh, hang on a minute. Okay, actually, I do recognize them. Let's not burn you. I can see that actually you were far more righteous than me, and you had the correct intentions all along. And she carries on with her pregnancy, and she gives birth to twins, one of whom is called Peret. We're going to come back to him later, so hold on to him. Now, traveling on much further along Jewish history, we come to this funny story with Rus and Boaz, the Shavuos Megillah story. Rus is a Moaviah, a female Moabitess, and she's actually a princess, and she comes across these long-lost Jews who have fled the country and come to Moab, and even though she's a princess, it's all very random, this story. She marries one of these men, and then he dies, and her sister also marries his brother, and the brother also dies. And then, the story with the 2 girls, they carry on with their mother-in-law, with Normie, and eventually Rus converts. And Rus and Normie return to Eretz Yisrael, and on the very day that Rus turns up in Eretz Yisrael, they walk into this huge gathering of people who have all just come from the kavura of the wife of Boaz, who was the head of everything at the time. He was the shofet, he was, the Godol Hadar, and he's just lost his wife, and he's just buried her. And lo and behold, this young lady called Rus emerges onto the scene, and it's really quite incredible because, a few weeks later on, they get to know each other, and they're actually related because Boaz is somehow related to her husband who died. and she sneaks into his shed where they did like all the threshing of the harvest in those days, in the middle of the night, and he's fast asleep, the god Hadar, and she goes and she uncovers his feet, which is a big clue. And when he wakes up in the morning, he sees his uncovered feet and he sees this lady Rus, and he's like, oh, I get what you're saying, I should actually be marrying you, because of this concept called Yibum, where the blood relative of the dead husband has to redeem the wife and marry her and then have a child. So he gets all that just from the uncovering of his feet, and he's like, you know what? He also says to her, you are very righteous. He actually calls her an Ashes Chayil, which I think is a very sweet thing to say, and he says, don't worry, I'm going to sort all this out. And eventually they get married, and the townspeople all give them this amazing bracha that they should be like Yehuda and Tamar. And Rashi comments there, because Boaz is a descendant of Peretz, who was the son of Yehuda and Tamar, if you remember. So straight away it connects them back to this story, and then it carries on. The whole of the last few Pesukim of the book of Rus is this whole lineage, all the way from Peretz to Boaz, and then onwards from Boaz to David HaMelech. And when we get to David HaMelech, we also have this very strange story with David and Bathsheba. He sees this lady bathing and he finds her attractive, and even though she's a married lady, he sleeps with her, she becomes pregnant, and then he comes up with a cunning plan to send her husband off to war where he gets killed, and then he can be with Bathsheba, who was the lady who he saw. And it happens that her husband does get killed, and Bathsheba is pregnant with this child, and this child actually, as a punishment, dies because David hasn't acted correctly. And Nassan, the Novi at the time, comes to talk to David about it, and David admits to it. He says, Chatasi, I have sinned, and he does teshuvah, and then him and Bathsheba are blessed with another child, and David chooses to call this child Shlomo, who we know becomes Shlomo HaMelech. And it's really interesting. In the Pasuk, David and Bathsheba call him Shlomo, and the next pasuk says Hashem calls this child Yedidia, which means beloved one of Hashem, and it says Hashem loves him. And the Malbim comments there that Hashem had already told David that he was going to have a child who was going to be the next king, and this child would be called Shlomo. And David had loads of children, and he hadn't called any of them Shlomo up until this point, but he chooses this particular child from this whole very strange story to be the one that's going to be the king. And it says that Hashem agreed with him. Hashem puts his haskama on it, his seal of approval, and he loves the child, and he also thinks that he should be the king, and that this whole lineage is going to come through Shlomo HaMelech. So if you go back to where we started from, we know there's going to be two Mashiachs. There's Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. So we've seen all these funny stories that come together with all these strange relationships that on the surface all look a bit dodgy, shall we say. They all produce, through Yosef and Osnas, from Shechem and Dinah, we have Mashiach ben Yosef, and through Yehuda and Tamar and Rus and Boaz and David and Bathsheba, we have Mashiach ben David. And it's just so strange that all of these strange events come together in this way. Each of these one-night stands, Dinah and Shechem was a one-off, Yehuda and Tamar was a one-off, Rus and Boaz was a one-off. Each of them in that one night produces a child that has a very huge part to play. Boaz actually dies the next day. He doesn't even stick around. So you can see there's really a big plan going on here. So why does Hashem write all this down? Why didn't he sweep it all under the carpet? So I think there's three things we can take from here. The first thing is that even as he's sending us into Golas, even as Yosef's sent to Mitzrayim and Osnas is sent there, and they're going through a really hard time, he's already, Hashem, planted the seeds of the redemption, which is going to happen thousands of years later. And all of these people along the way, they don't know what's happening to them or why it's happening to them or why they're having a hard time. But Hashem writing all this down for us is showing us life's not random. It's hard, but there is a big plan, and each of us is a part of it. The second thing that we can take from here is that some of them did make mistakes. Yehuda possibly made a mistake. David possibly made a mistake. But they did a teshuvah, and they were still included as part of the plan. We're human beings, and it's okay to make mistakes. It happens. this whole route to Mashiach through all these, like, this murky path, it teaches us that we're not defined by our past. It's not where we come from that's important. It's where we're going to, what we're becoming. You can grow into anything that you want to be. And finally, this is the thing that is my pet peeve. It's okay to talk about this, about relationships, about marriage. It's not taboo. If the Torah feels that the Torah can talk about it, and it's all over the Gemara as well, you can see all of these women who took matters into their own hands. We have what Tamar did. We have that Dinah left her house, and some people say that's not okay that she left her house, or that Tamar dressed up as a prostitute and seduced her father-in-law, that Ruth went and uncovered the feet of the Gadol Hadar. History proves that they were all vindicated. It was all part of a big plan, and they played a key part in it. This wasn't lust. This was like the highest form of having a physical relationship, because it was only to be part of this grand scheme. It was a completely spiritual endeavor. And, there wasn't any hint of inappropriateness on their part. And the reason that we don't talk about relationships and our own personal relationships is not because they're dirty or embarrassing. It's because they're private and they're special, and they're intimate, and keeping it that way between oneself and one's spouse ensures that it stays very special. But it doesn't mean the actual act of having a physical relationship that there's anything naughty or taboo about it. And I think the more we actually talk to our children about it and not cover it all up and skip out those bits, I think the more we do that, it teaches them that there's something naughty, or that it's a secret, that we're not allowed to talk about it. And how can we ever expect them to have a good relationship then, if they've never spoken about it or seen it modeled? So 3 things, just to summarize. Life's not random. There's a plan, and there's a reason you're going through something hard. You just don't know what it is yet. Secondly, where you come from isn't important. It's who you become. And thirdly, don't make physical relationships taboo in your home, because it implies that it's naughty or bad. And the best place for your children to learn about healthy and loving relationships is in the home that they grow up in. Anyway, I'll leave you with those thoughts. Have a very good Shabbos.